15 years of friendship ended with a text message that read, "I think it's better if we don't talk for a while," sent by the woman who had been my maid of honor, my emergency contact, my 2 a.m. phone call when nothing else in my life made sense. She sent it 4 days after she quietly took the biggest deal of my career and put her own name on it. 18 months later, on the morning she was supposed to open her very first flagship store, with a ribbon cutting scheduled for 10 o'clock and a local news crew already setting up outside, the doors stayed locked, the lights stayed off, and the woman who had built that store on the back of my work never showed up to cut anything at all. I'm the reason the doors didn't open. Not because I broke in and locked them myself. Because 16 months after she ended our friendship over text, my job put a file on my desk with her company's name on it, and for the first time in 15 years, I finally had a reason to look at Monica Sullivan with the kind of attention she'd spent her whole career hoping I never would. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time, where we tell the stories that prove the truth doesn't need your help to find its way out, it just needs time. If you have ever loved someone so completely that you handed them the blueprint to your own life without a second thought, if you've ever found out that the person closest to you had been quietly measuring you for a replacement the whole time, this story is for you, and I promise you, the ending is worth staying for. My name is Julia Anderson. I'm 34 years old, and for the better part of a decade I built something with my own 2 hands that I was, for a long time, foolishly proud to share with someone else. Today I work as a brand compliance and intellectual property consultant for a retail advisory firm, the kind of job where companies hire me to look at their vendor contracts and their supplier files and tell them, quietly and precisely, when something doesn't add up. I didn't start out in this career. I fell into it sideways, out of the wreckage of the business I actually built, and I want to tell you both stories, the one I built and the one that took it from me, because you can't understand what happened at the end without understanding everything that came before it. I met Monica Sullivan on the first day of 6th grade, in a school cafeteria in a town small enough that everyone's parents already knew each other, when she sat down across from me because, in her words years later, I looked like I needed someone to talk to and she looked like she needed someone to listen to her talk. That was Kayla in one sentence, honestly. She talked, and the world listened, and somehow, from that lunch table onward, I became the person standing closest to her when it did. We were an unlikely pair in the way best friends often are. Kayla was the loud one, the funny one, the one who could walk into a room of strangers and leave with a nickname and 3 new group chats. I was quieter, more careful, the kind of kid who read the instructions before assembling anything and who took a strange, private comfort in doing things correctly. Kayla used to tease me about it affectionately, calling me her measure-twice friend, and for 15 years I wore that nickname like something between us, a private language nobody else got to speak. We went to different colleges but talked every single day. We stood up in each other's early relationships, cried through each other's breakups, drove 6 hours through a snowstorm for each other's family funerals. When I tell you that Monica Sullivan was, for the first 3 decades of my life, the most consistent relationship I had outside of my own parents, I am not exaggerating for the sake of the story. She was woven into the actual architecture of who I became. And that, it turns out, is exactly what made it so easy for her to walk into the one room where I'd built something entirely my own, and quietly measure it for herself. I started making ceramics in my mid-20s, in the spare bedroom of a rented duplex, mostly as a way to keep my hands busy during a stretch of unemployment I didn't want to think too hard about. What began as a hobby, a handful of uneven bowls I gave away as gifts, slowly turned into something else, small batches of hand-thrown vases and hand-poured candles I sold at a local farmer's market on weekends, then online, then, eventually, into a real brand with a real name. I called it Linden & Co., after the linden tree that used to grow outside my grandmother's kitchen window, the one she used to say smelled like honey in June. Kayla was there for almost every part of it, in the specific, embedded way that made it feel less like she was watching my business grow and more like she was a quiet, unofficial second half of it. She worked in marketing, freelance mostly, jumping between small clients, and she offered, early on, to help me build out my website and my social presence, in exchange for nothing more than wine and the occasional free candle, she used to joke. I said yes without hesitating, because why wouldn't I? This was Kayla. This was the person I'd trust with anything. Over the years, that help never really stopped, and it never really became formal either. She sat in on my supplier calls sometimes, taking notes because she said she was better at keeping meetings organized than I was. She had access to my product mood boards, my pricing spreadsheets, my early prototype sketches, the actual private notebooks where I worked out color palettes and glaze formulas months before anything went into production. I never once thought to draw a line around any of it, because in my mind there was no meaningful difference between Kayla and me. I would have shown her my diary. In a lot of ways, for 15 years, my business plans essentially were my diary. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters to the shape of this story. There were moments, small ones, easy to wave away individually, that in hindsight formed a pattern I simply didn't want to see. Kayla would sometimes describe Linden and Co. to strangers using the word we, which I found endearing rather than strange, because I genuinely believed she felt like a part of it. She once suggested, half joking over drinks, that we should just formalize things and make her a partner, and when I hesitated, worried about diluting something I'd built from nothing, she laughed it off immediately and told me she was kidding. Of course she was kidding. I believed her. I always believed her. That was the entire architecture of our friendship, built on 15 years of me never once needing to ask whether Kayla meant what she said. The business grew slowly and then, in the way these things sometimes do, all at once. By my early 30s, Linden and Co. had a small but devoted following, a modest but real wholesale relationship with a handful of boutique stores, and a reputation, at least in the small orbit of home goods and design, for a very specific look, warm, imperfect. I remember the exact week it started to feel real, because it was the same week I got the email that would eventually become the biggest opportunity of my career, and also, without my knowing it yet, the beginning of the end of my friendship with Monica Sullivan. The email came from a buyer at a national home goods retailer, a chain most of you would recognize immediately if I named it, though I'm going to leave that detail out for reasons that will become obvious later. Their team had come across Linden and Co. through a regional trade show, and they were interested in a pilot program, a curated capsule collection of my pieces rolled out across a limited number of stores, with the possibility, if it performed well, of a much larger national contract the following year. For a business my size, this wasn't just an opportunity. It was the opportunity, the kind that either changes the entire trajectory of your work or, if it goes wrong, quietly ends it. I told Kayla before I told almost anyone else, sitting on her kitchen floor with a bottle of wine between us, the two of us screaming into a couch cushion the way you do when something has finally, actually happened after years of hoping it might. She hugged me so hard I nearly spilled the wine, and she told me, and I remember this specific sentence because I turned it over so many times afterward, that she was so proud of me she could barely stand it. She'd watched me build this from literally nothing, and that whatever I needed from her to get this deal across the finish line, she was there. What I needed, it turned out, was help preparing the pitch deck, the retail forecasting, the supply chain scaling plan that would prove to a national buyer that a woman working out of a converted garage studio could actually deliver product at scale without falling apart. Kayla, with her marketing background, offered to help me build all of it, the way she always had, and I said yes, the way I always did, and over the following 2 months we spent nearly every evening together, hunched over my laptop, building out projected unit costs and packaging concepts and a full brand story deck that laid out, in granular detail, exactly who Linden and Co. was, where it was headed, and how it planned to get there. I sent the pitch deck to the buyer myself, from my own email, under my own name, on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I remember the date specifically because it was also the day my father had a minor health scare that pulled my attention away for most of the week, and it was Kayla, of course, who sat with me in the hospital waiting room, who drove me home afterward, who told me not to worry about the pitch, that it would speak for itself, that I'd done everything right. For 6 weeks, I heard nothing. This isn't unusual in the retail world. Buyers move slowly, decisions get made in committees that don't answer to your anxiety, and I told myself repeatedly that no news wasn't bad news. Kayla checked in on the deal constantly during that stretch, more than I probably would have on my own, asking almost daily whether I'd heard anything, whether I'd followed up, whether I wanted her to reach out to any of her own contacts to help move things along. I found her investment touching at the time. I did not yet understand that some of those questions weren't coming from support. Some of them, I would later learn, were coming from someone tracking a clock. The email that ended it arrived on a Thursday, from the same buyer, polite and professionally worded in the specific, deflating way that rejection dresses itself up in corporate language. She thanked me for the pitch, told me the team had been genuinely impressed with the craftsmanship and the brand story, and then explained that they'd ultimately decided to move forward with a different vendor whose product line, in her words, felt like a slightly more scalable fit for their current retail strategy. She wished me well. She said she hoped our paths would cross again. I sat with that email for a long time before I could bring myself to open it a second time, and when I did, I noticed the line I'd skimmed past the first time in my rush to absorb the bad news. The vendor they'd chosen instead was a home goods brand called Ashgrove. I remember reading that name and feeling nothing at all, because it meant nothing to me. I had never heard of Ashgrove. I assumed, reasonably, that some larger, better-funded competitor had simply beaten me to a deal I was never guaranteed in the first place. I called Kayla in tears that night, the way I'd called her after every hard thing in my adult life, and she stayed on the phone with me for 2 hours, telling me it wasn't fair, that the retail world was broken, that companies like mine got overlooked by bigger names constantly, that this didn't mean anything about the quality of what I'd built. I believed every word of it. I had no reason not to. It took 4 months for the truth to reach me, and when it did, it didn't come from Kayla at all. It came from a mutual friend, someone from our old college circle, who sent me a screenshot one evening with a message that just said, "Wait, is this the same Kayla?" The screenshot was an Instagram post announcing the launch of Ashgrove, a home goods brand described in the caption as founded by creative entrepreneur Monica Sullivan. Featuring a product photo of hand-thrown, earth-toned ceramic vases and hand-poured candles that I recognized instantly, viscerally, in the specific way you recognize your own handwriting even when someone else is holding the pen. I want to describe to you exactly what that recognition felt like, because I think anyone who has ever had something they made taken and repackaged by someone they trusted will understand it precisely. It wasn't just similar. It was my color palette, the same warm, muted earth tones I'd spent 2 years developing through countless failed glaze tests. It was my packaging concept, the unbleached craft paper and twine I'd sketched out in a notebook Kayla had access to 100 times over. It was, when I finally forced myself to read through the brand story on Ashgrove's website, almost word for word the origin narrative I had written myself, about a grandmother's kitchen, about a tree that smelled like honey in June, with the details changed just enough that I imagine Kayla told herself it counted as different. I called her that night, and she picked up on the second ring, which in hindsight tells me she'd been expecting the call for a while and had simply been waiting to see how long it would take. I don't remember every word of that conversation. Grief has a way of erasing the exact transcript and leaving only the feeling behind, but I remember she didn't deny it. I remember she used the phrase "inspired by," as though that explained anything, as though 15 years of friendship had taught her nothing about the difference between inspiration and theft. I remember asking her, directly, whether she was the vendor that beat me for the retail deal, and I remember the silence before she said yes, and I remember that in that silence I finally understood the shape of the previous 6 months in a way I hadn't let myself understand it while it was happening. If you have ever had a friendship you thought was unbreakable quietly turn into something you no longer recognized, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time right now, because what happened over the following 18 months is proof that some things you build honestly find their way back to you, even after someone else has tried to take them. The days after that phone call are, honestly, some of the hardest of my adult life to talk about, harder in some ways than the loss of the deal itself, because the deal was a business opportunity and Kayla was 15 years of my life. I kept waiting for her to call back with some explanation that made it make sense, some context that would let me file this away as a misunderstanding rather than what it plainly was. That call never came. For days after our conversation, she sent the text message I mentioned at the beginning of this story, the one that said she thought it was better if we didn't talk for a while, as though I was the one who needed a cooling-off period, as though what had happened between us was a disagreement rather than a theft. I did not respond to that text. I have never responded to that text. I sat with it the way you sit with something you can't quite believe is real, reading it over and over, waiting for it to eventually make sense, and it never did. What followed was, functionally, a small business dying in slow motion, which is a very specific and very lonely kind of grief. Linden & Co. didn't collapse overnight. It simply lost the momentum that a national retail deal would have given it, and without that momentum, the smaller wholesale accounts I'd built over the years weren't enough to sustain the overhead I'd taken on preparing for a scale-up that never came. I laid myself off, essentially, 6 months later, closing the studio I'd rented, selling off equipment I couldn't justify keeping, packing 5 years of my life into boxes that went into a storage unit I still, to this day, pay a monthly fee for and have never fully opened. My family and friends fractured around me the way they do after something like this, in smaller, quieter ways than you'd expect. Some people in our shared circle sided with me immediately and cut Kayla off without hesitation. Others, to my genuine surprise, found ways to stay neutral, telling me gently that they were sure there was more to the story, that Kayla surely hadn't meant to hurt me, using the specific soft language people use when they'd rather not lose a friend than take a side. I understood it, even as it isolated me further. Betrayal this specific doesn't come with an obvious villain costume. It just comes with someone you loved, doing something you never thought they were capable of, and everyone around you deciding independently how much of that they're willing to believe. I took a job about 8 months later with a retail advisory and compliance firm, work I'd fallen into somewhat by accident through a former wholesale buyer who knew my background and thought my eye for product detail, paired with the harsh business education I'd just survived, would translate well into the kind of vendor auditing and intellectual property compliance work her firm specialized in. She wasn't wrong. I turned out to be good at it, in the specific, focused way people become good at things when the alternative is sitting still with their own grief. I learned contract law, trade dress protections, the language of NDAs and licensing agreements, all the structural things I hadn't known to protect myself with the first time, and I built, over the following year, an entirely new professional identity out of the wreckage of the one Kayla had taken from me. I muted Ashgrove's social media within the first week and never unmuted it. I heard about its growth secondhand, the way you hear about an ex's new relationship, through mutual friends who couldn't help but mention it, through the specific grapevine that exists whenever someone you used to know starts becoming visible in a world you used to be part of. I heard they'd taken on an investor. I heard they were planning a flagship retail location. I let myself hear it and then let it go, because the alternative was letting it live in my head rent-free, and I had already given Kayla enough of my life for free. 16 months after that phone call, I was assigned to a new engagement at work, a routine vendor compliance audit for a regional retail group that had recently acquired a chain of home goods stores and, standard practice after any acquisition of that size, wanted an independent review of the incoming vendor contracts to check for red flags, licensing gaps, IP disputes, anything that might expose the new parent company to legal risk down the line. This is, for what it's worth, an extremely ordinary kind of assignment in my field. I had done dozens of them by that point, reviewing vendor files the way an auditor reviews receipts, methodically, without any particular emotional stake in what I found. I want to be completely clear about something, the same way the narrator of every story like this always insists on being clear, because I know exactly how convenient it sounds in hindsight. Nobody staffed me on this project because of any connection to Kayla. Nobody at my firm knew her name, knew anything about Ashgrove, knew anything about what had happened to Linden and Company. I was assigned because I was available and qualified, the same as I'd been assigned to 40 other files before it. It was on the second day of document review, cross-referencing the acquired retail group's vendor contracts against their original licensing and supplier disclosures, that I saw the name. Ashgrove Home Goods, one of 11 vendors flagged for expedited review due to what the file simply labeled as inconsistent supplier documentation. My stomach did something I can only describe as a kind of controlled free fall, the sensation of a floor you didn't know was there suddenly giving way beneath you. I sat with that file closed in front of me for what felt like a long time before I opened it. I did exactly what I am trained to do, and exactly what I would have done for any vendor whose name meant something to me personally. I flagged the conflict of interest to my engagement lead immediately, disclosed in writing that Ashgrove's founder was a former close friend with whom I had an unresolved personal and professional history, and formally recused myself from any interviews, negotiations, or direct assessments involving her company, while continuing on the broader document review, where any findings tied to her file would be independently verified by a colleague rather than taken on my word alone. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think it matters. I did not go looking for a reason to hurt Kayla. The file was simply already sitting there, in a stack of 11 other vendors, waiting for someone thorough enough to actually read it closely. What the review eventually uncovered, over the following several weeks, wasn't a single clean violation but a pattern, the kind auditors are specifically trained to notice because individually each piece looks small. Ashgrove's original investor pitch deck, which the acquiring retail group had requested as part of standard due diligence, described its entire product line and brand identity as originally developed in-house by its founder, with no mention of any prior collaborator, contractor, or outside contributor. That representation mattered enormously, because investors don't just fund products, they fund the legal certainty that those products are actually owned free and clear by the company they're investing in. Buried in an old, half-forgotten freelance contract from years earlier, one I barely remembered signing, back when Kayla had briefly done paid marketing consulting for an early version of Linden & Co. before we ever formalized anything, was a standard mutual non-disclosure and work product clause, the kind boilerplate agreements include almost as an afterthought, stating that any brand materials, product concepts, or creative assets developed or shared during that engagement remain the intellectual property of Linden & Co., not to be used, replicated, or commercialized independently. Kayla, it turned out, had used that same original brand story, verbatim in significant sections, in Ashgrove's investor materials, had adapted my documented glaze formulas closely enough that Trade Dress Council flagged it without any prompting from me, and had, critically, never disclosed to her own investors that any of it originated from prior work she had done for someone else's company under a contract that legally reserved those rights. In the specific language of the world I now worked in, this wasn't just an ethical betrayal anymore. It was a material misrepresentation to investors, layered on top of a straightforward intellectual property dispute, the exact combination that turns a personal grievance into something a legal and compliance team is obligated to act on regardless of whose name is attached to it. I did not celebrate when I understood the full shape of it. I remember, honestly, feeling almost nothing at first, just a strange, heavy quiet, the particular stillness that comes after you've been vindicated in a way you never actually wanted to need. I finished my portion of the review. I documented my findings with the same precision I'd apply to any file. And then I did the only thing that felt entirely mine to do in the whole situation. I let the process work exactly the way it was built to work, without adding a single word of my own opinion to it. If any part of this is resonating with you, if you've ever watched the truth take its time finding its way to the surface on its own schedule, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for Calm Stories time now, because what happened to Ashgrove over the following 2 months unfolded in a way none of us, including me, could have fully predicted. My portion of the audit concluded with a formal finding, reviewed and independently confirmed by a colleague with no personal connection to either party, that Ashgrove's investor disclosures contained material misrepresentations regarding intellectual property ownership, and that at least a portion of its core product line and brand narrative was subject to a pre-existing ownership claim under a contract predating the company's founding. That finding went, as every finding in an engagement like this does, to the acquiring retail group's legal and risk department, not to me personally, and certainly not to Kayla directly. What happened after that was entirely out of my hands, governed by processes and obligations that exist independently of anyone's feelings, including mine. Under the terms of most acquisition due diligence agreements, a material misrepresentation discovered in a vendor's founding documentation triggers an automatic contractual review, and in this case, it triggered something more specific. The acquiring retail group's legal team, once informed, had an obligation not only to the deal at hand but, given that Ashgrove had been actively soliciting a second, larger round of outside investment at the exact time the finding surfaced, a disclosure obligation to flag the issue formally, since continuing to represent Ashgrove's IP position as clean to prospective new investors, once the retailer's own legal team knew otherwise, would have exposed the retail group itself to liability. I learned what happened next mostly secondhand, through public records and, eventually, through my mother, who to my surprise had stayed loosely in touch with Kayla's mother over the years the way mothers of old best friends sometimes quietly do, long after their daughters have stopped speaking. Word reached Ashgrove's primary investor, a small private equity group that had put up the bulk of the funding for the flagship retail location Kayla had been planning for months, that the company's foundational IP claims were in dispute and that its own investor materials had misrepresented the origin of its core product line. Investors do not, generally, respond well to discovering that the story they funded wasn't entirely true. The flagship store had been in development for the better part of a year by that point, a physical retail location in a mid-sized city about 90 minutes from where I live, the first real brick-and-mortar presence for Ashgrove, meant to serve as proof of concept for the larger national expansion Kayla had been chasing since the day she took my deal out from under me. The opening had been scheduled, planned, promoted, a local news segment arranged, a ribbon cutting with the city's Small Business Development Office, the kind of launch that represents not just a business milestone but a public declaration that you've made it. The investor pulled the remaining committed funding 11 days before that opening, once its own counsel confirmed independently what my firm's findings had already flagged, a decision that under the terms of their agreement they were fully entitled to make given the misrepresentation. Without that final tranche of funding, the build-out wasn't finished, inventory wasn't fully paid for, and the vendor relationships Kayla had built to supply the physical store began unraveling in the specific, cascading way that happens when a small business suddenly loses the capital it was counting on to cross a finish line it had already publicly announced. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not orchestrate the timing of any of this. I had no authority to freeze funding, pull an investor, or delay an opening, and I never spoke to anyone at the investor's firm at any point in the process. I simply did my job accurately, disclosed a conflict the moment I recognized it, and led institutions with far more power than I had ever handled the rest exactly the way they were designed to. The morning of what was supposed to be Ashgrove's grand opening, I was, by pure coincidence of scheduling, at my own desk finishing an entirely unrelated report, unaware that 90 minutes away, a small crowd was beginning to gather outside a storefront with butcher paper still covering half the windows and a ribbon that would never actually get cut. I learned the details the way I'd learned everything else in this story, through people who weren't directly involved but couldn't resist telling someone. A former mutual friend who lived in that city had gone to support the opening, expecting a celebration, and instead found a locked door, a taped-up sign citing an unspecified delay, and a small cluster of confused vendors standing outside with delivery trucks they had no instructions for. The local news crew that had been scheduled to cover the launch ran a much smaller, much less flattering segment instead, about a promising local startup whose opening had been abruptly postponed amid what the brief report vaguely described as internal business matters. I heard, over the following weeks, through that same slow, unreliable grapevine that once again seemed determined to keep me updated on a life I'd tried hard to stop watching, that Ashgrove's situation deteriorated quickly once the funding fell through. Without the final investment round, Kayla couldn't cover the build-out costs already incurred, couldn't pay several vendors in full, and within 2 months had laid off the small team she'd hired to help launch the store. The flagship location, the one meant to be proof that she'd built something real, sat empty, its lease eventually terminated, its butcher-papered windows never fully uncovered before the space was leased out to someone else entirely. I did not reach out to her during any of this. I did not comment publicly, did not mention it to our shared circle, did not do anything at all beyond continuing to do the job I was already doing before her file ever landed on my desk. What surprised me most, honestly, was how little satisfaction I felt in the moment I first heard the store hadn't opened. I had spent so long imagining, in the private, unglamorous way grief lets you imagine things, some version of a reckoning, and when an actual one arrived, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching weather happen to someone from a very great distance, something that had its own momentum entirely separate from me. Kayla texted me for the first time in over a year, 3 weeks after the failed opening, a single message that read simply, "Did you have something to do with this?" No question mark. I remember noticing that detail specifically, because after 15 years of knowing exactly how she wrote when she was upset, I recognized the flatness of it immediately. I responded, calmly, the same way I'd respond to any client asking about the boundaries of a completed engagement. I told her I had been staffed on an unrelated compliance audit, that I had disclosed my conflict of interest the moment I recognized her company's name, that I had not conducted a single interview or conversation involving her file directly, and that any findings tied to her business had been independently confirmed by a colleague, not authored by me alone. I told her I understood if she didn't believe any of it, but that it happened to be true, and that after everything, I didn't feel any particular need to make it sound prettier than it was. She didn't respond to that message. To this day, she never has. If you've ever watched something you built get taken by someone you trusted, and then watched, quietly, from a distance, as the truth eventually found its own way back to them, hit subscribe to Calm Stories time, because the way the rest of our shared world responded to all of this taught me more about people than 15 years of friendship ever did. What happened in the months afterward, among the people who had known both of us for most of our adult lives, was its own strange education in how differently people process the same set of facts. Some of our old college friends reached out to me almost immediately once word got around about Ashgrove's collapse, several of them apologizing, unprompted, for having stayed quiet or neutral when the original theft first came to light, telling me they wished they'd said something sooner. I appreciated it, genuinely, even as I noticed the specific timing of that courage, arriving only once the outcome made taking my side the easier, safer position. Others took a different path entirely, and this was the part one found hardest to sit with. A handful of people in our shared circle decided, apparently, that the timing of my compliance finding and Kayla's failed opening was simply too convenient to be coincidence, and quietly started a version of the story in which I had somehow used my job to orchestrate her downfall out of long-simmering jealousy and revenge. I heard about this the way I heard about everything, secondhand, filtered through people who felt obligated to warn me what was being said. It stung in a way I hadn't expected, the specific sting of being punished a second time for the consequences of someone else's choices, simply because those consequences happened to be inconvenient for the story some people preferred to believe. I made a decision, around that time, that I've held on to since, which is that I was not going to spend my limited energy defending the accuracy of my own professional conduct to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. I had disclosed my conflict of interest the moment it existed. I had recused myself properly. I had let a process with checks entirely independent of me reach its own conclusion. That was true whether or not everyone in my orbit chose to believe it, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't need their belief in order to know it. Kayla's mother, according to my own mother, told a version of events in which Kayla had been the victim of an unfair, almost coordinated professional attack, a framing I understood, in the specific, forgiving way you can understand a mother's instinct to protect her child even when the facts don't support it. I don't hold that against her. I think if the situation had been reversed, my own mother would have done exactly the same thing, and there is a particular kind of grace in recognizing that some people's loyalty was never going to be about the facts in the first place. I never spoke to Kayla again after that unanswered text. I've thought, sometimes, about what I would say if she ever reached out properly, with an actual apology instead of an accusation, and I honestly don't know. I don't think I'm owed an apology in order to move forward, and I've also stopped waiting for one, because waiting for it was its own quiet way of keeping her relevant in a life she'd already done enough damage to. It's been just over 2 years now since the phone call that ended our friendship, and close to a year since Ashgrove quietly dissolved for good, its remaining assets sold off, its social media accounts going dark one by one until the whole thing simply stopped existing, the way businesses sometimes do, not with a dramatic final post but with a slow, unremarked silence. I don't know exactly where Kayla is now. I know, through the last thread of the old grapevine I still occasionally hear from, that she moved out of state, that she's working again in marketing, this time for someone else's company rather than her own. I don't take any particular pleasure in telling you that. I simply think it matters to the honesty of this story, because so many of you watching are probably wondering whether the people who take something from you ever really lose anything in return, and the answer, more often than people expect, is a quiet, unglamorous yes, not because anyone engineers it, but because things built on someone else's foundation rarely hold weight for long. I rebuilt Linden & Co. about a year ago, slowly, on nights and weekends, not because I need the income, my work in compliance pays the bills comfortably, but because I realized somewhere in the middle of all of this that I wasn't willing to let the thing I'd built with my own hands become something I only associated with loss. It's smaller now, more careful, sold through a short list of boutique stores I trust and a modest online shop I run almost entirely by myself. I've since learned, thoroughly, the language of contracts, NDAs, and intellectual property protections that I never bothered to learn the first time, back when I thought love and trust were the only agreements that mattered between people. I've made new friends in the years since, slower to trust than I used to be, though I don't think that's entirely a loss. I've learned there's a real difference between the friendships that ask you to hand over everything you have all at once, and the ones that let you keep a few careful things for yourself, not out of suspicion, but out of a hard-earned understanding that even the people who love you the most are still, underneath everything, capable of choices you never saw coming. What I want to leave you with, more than the satisfaction of watching someone face the consequences of what they took, is this. I never once had to lie, manipulate, or manufacture anything for the truth about Ashgrove to surface. I did my job honestly, disclosed exactly what I was obligated to disclose, and let a system built for exactly this kind of situation do precisely what it was designed to do. If you are sitting somewhere right now, carrying a betrayal that feels unfinished, that feels like the person who hurt you simply got to walk away with what they took, I want you to hear me say that very few people actually walk away clean. Most of them are still mid-flight, still building on a foundation that was never fully theirs to begin with, and you may not be in the room the day it finally gives way. But more often than you'd expect, it does. I don't wish Kayla harm, even now, even after everything, and I think that surprises people when I say it. What I wish is that she'd simply asked me, all those years ago, for what she actually wanted, instead of quietly deciding to take it. I would have said yes to a real partnership. I said yes to almost everything else she ever asked me for 15 years. I never got the chance to say yes to that, because she never gave me the chance to be asked. That's my story. 15 years of friendship, a business built on trust one never thought to protect, and a truth that found its own way to the surface on a schedule I never controlled and never needed to. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever watched the truth take its time and then arrive exactly when it needed to, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because there are so many more stories like this one still to come, and I don't want you to miss the next one. I'll see you there.